Picture this. It's August 1945, and Japan is completely destroyed. Not damaged, destroyed. About 40% of the nation's industrial plants and infrastructure are gone. Production has reverted to levels from 15 years earlier. National income has dropped by 15%. Manufacturing and mining production has collapsed by 40%. Japan's per capita GDP is just $1,346, only 11% of the American figure, and barely 47% of Japan's own pre-war level. The devastation is so complete that Japan has lost approximately 1/4 of its national wealth and 1/3 of its production capacity. But here's what makes this story absolutely fascinating. Within 25 years, Japan became the world's second largest economy, growing at an average annual rate of 9 to 10% from 1950 to 1970. How? Through one of the most remarkable transformations in economic history, funded by approximately $2.2 billion in American aid, supplemented by over $2 billion in Korean War procurement orders, and executed with strategic brilliance by the Japanese government. And here's the irony. America rebuilt its future economic competitor to serve as a Cold War bulwark against communism, then spent the next 40 years dealing with massive trade deficits as Japan's exports flooded American markets. Hey, I'm Brandon, and welcome back to My Money Mint, the channel where I dive into topics related to money and wealth. All right, let's get into it. To understand how remarkable Japan's recovery was, you need to understand just how devastating the destruction was in 1945. The air raids on Japan's urban centers left millions displaced. Food shortages worsened when the seizure of foodstuffs from Korea, Taiwan, and China ceased. About 5.1 million Japanese returned to Japan in the 15 months following October 1st, 1945, and another million returned in 1947. A 20% population increase in a country that couldn't feed its existing population. The Reconstruction Finance Cash Office had issued bonds that the Bank of Japan immediately underwrote and printed money, causing extraordinary inflation and excessive demand. Hyperinflation was destroying whatever economy remained. Initially, America's plans for Japan were punitive, not helpful. The U.S. initial post-surrender policy aimed for economic demilitarization. Japan should be permitted to retain no specialized facilities for the production or repair of implements of war, and be deprived of its heavy industry capacity in excess of normal peacetime requirements. Reparations for Japanese aggression were to be made through transfer of Japanese property and such goods or existing capital equipment and facilities as are not necessary for a peaceful Japanese economy. The Far Eastern Commission decided that Japan was to be partly deindustrialized, with dismantling of Japanese industry foreseen to reduce living standards to 1930 to 1934 levels. 15 zaibatsu, the massive family-controlled business conglomerates, were ordered dissolved, including Mitsubishi, Mitsui, Sumitomo, and Yasuda. The Diet enacted the Act for Elimination of Excessive Concentration of Economic Power. Agricultural land reform was implemented. Tenant farmland decreased from 45.9% in 1945 to 9.9% in 1950 as land was redistributed to farmers. SCAP, Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, originally planned to break up 325 Japanese companies to prevent Japan from ever becoming a military threat again. America wanted to permanently weaken Japan, destroy its industrial capacity, break up its corporate power structures, make sure it could never threaten peace again. But then something changed, something that would completely reverse American policy and lead to massive economic aid instead of punishment. By late 1947 and early 1948, the emergence of an economic crisis in Japan, alongside concerns about the spread of communism, sparked a reconsideration of occupation policies in what's called the reverse course. SCAP became concerned that a weak Japanese economy would increase the influence of the domestic communist movement. And with a communist victory in China's civil war increasingly likely, the future of East Asia appeared to be at stake. The reverse course began in 1947 in response to the emerging global Cold War. U.S. priorities shifted from punishing and reforming Japan to ensuring internal political stability and rebuilding the economy. As a result of the reverse course, instead of breaking up 325 companies, In the end, only the 11 largest companies were dissolved. The Zaibatsu dissolution was never completed, allowing them to partially reform as informal associations known as keiretsu. America's strategic calculation had completely changed. Better to have a strong capitalist Japan as a bulwark against communism than a weak, potentially communist Japan. And that meant money, lots of money. Total US assistance to Japan from 1946 to 1952 was roughly $2.2 billion, equivalent to $15.2 billion in 2005 dollars. Of that, almost $1.7 billion was grants and $504 million was loans. Over three-quarters, 77%, of these funds were provided through Garioa grants, government aid, and relief in occupied areas. About 59% of this aid was in the form of food, 15% in industrial materials, and 12% in transportation equipment. The cost of the Garioa program for Japan totaled $311 million during fiscal year 1946 to 1947 alone. In the Garioa appropriation for fiscal year 1948 to 1949, Congress authorized expenditure of funds for economic rehabilitation of Japan, allowing use of Garioa funds to import materials for export industries. Now, $2.2 billion might not sound like massive aid compared to Europe's Marshall Plan. And you'd be right. Germany received $4.3 billion, about double what Japan got, including both Garioa and Marshall Plan aid. Japan didn't receive Marshall Plan aid because that was for Europe only. About 40% of US assistance to Japan was considered targeted at economic infrastructure reconstruction, less focused than the Marshall Plan's comprehensive rebuilding. But here's where Japan's story gets really interesting. The Korean War turned Japan into an economic powerhouse almost overnight. On June 25, 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea. The United States needed a rear base for operations, somewhere close to Korea to repair equipment, produce supplies, and support military operations. Japan was perfect, and the procurement orders were massive. The US government paid the Japanese government large sums for special military procurement, which amounted to 27% of Japan's total export trade during the war. Supplies from Japan totaled $149 million in 1950 and $809 million in 1953. Foreign currency derived from US Army and military personnel reached $590 million in 1951 and over $800 million both in 1952 and 1953. Japan's heavy industries, which were on the verge of bankruptcy, were saved by orders to repair thousands of damaged planes and military vehicles. Car companies like Toyota flourished with orders for numerous trucks and other military vehicles. Large contracts were written with Japanese companies for supplies, ships, pharmaceuticals, oil, beer, and more. Major companies like Mitsubishi, Sumitomo, and Mitsui were saved from bankruptcy by US investment. Let me give you specific examples of how Korean War orders transformed Japanese companies. Toyota received an order for 1,000 Model BM trucks on July 31, 1950, then 2,329 trucks on August 29th, and another 1,350 trucks on March 1, 1951, a total of 4,679 trucks worth 3.66 billion yen. In June 1950, Toyota produced only 300 trucks and was on the verge of going out of business. The Korean War orders revived the company completely. In 1950, company executives, including AG Toyota, took a trip to the United States where they trained at Ford Motor Company and observed operations of dozens of US manufacturers. This gave rise to the Toyota Way and the Toyota production system that would revolutionize manufacturing worldwide. Honda was fueled by large orders from the US military for trucks and other war material, allowing Honda to erect a large factory in Tokyo equipped with conveyor lines and machines for mass-producing motorcycles. Sony was founded in 1946. In 1952, Ibuka visited the United States and made initial contacts for licensing the transistor from Bell Laboratories. In 1953, Morita signed the deal with Western Electric. Masaru Ibuka and Akio Morita secured a license from Western Electric for just $25,000 to use transistor technology. Sony's TR-63 radio cracked open the US market, and launched the new industry of consumer microelectronics, with portable transistor radios growing from 100,000 units in 1955 to 5 million by 1968. These companies weren't just being saved, they were learning American technology, American manufacturing techniques, and American business practices that they would use to eventually dominate global markets. But American money and technology transfer were only part of the story. The Japanese government executed a brilliant strategic response. MITI, the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, was created in May 1949 and given the mission of coordinating international trade policy. MITI facilitated the early development of nearly all major industries by providing protection from import competition, technological intelligence, help in licensing foreign technology, access to foreign exchange, and assistance in mergers. According to scholar Chalmers Johnson, the particular speed, form, and consequences of Japanese economic growth are not intelligible without reference to the contributions of MITI. MITI's role began with the policy concerning industrial rationalization in 1950 that coordinated efforts by industries to counteract SCAP's deflationary regulations, formalizing cooperation between the Japanese government and private industry. This wasn't free market capitalism. This was strategic industrial policy on a massive scale. MITI formulated cooperation such that if MITI wished to double steel production, the Neo-Zaibatsu already has the capital, the construction assets, the makers of production machinery, and most of the other necessary factors already available in-house. The incomplete suppression of the Zaibatsu actually helped this strategy. The business groups could cooperate closely with government direction while maintaining the scale and resources needed for rapid growth. And then there was the exchange rate advantage. In spring 1949, the Japanese government adopted a comprehensive stabilization program that established a single exchange rate at 360 yen per US dollar. That exchange rate was maintained until 1971, when the United States abandoned the gold standard. By 1971, the yen had become severely undervalued. Japanese exports were costing too little in international markets, and imports from abroad were costing the Japanese too much. Japan's current account balance had risen from deficits in the early 1960s to a then large surplus of $5.8 billion by 1971, reflecting the yen's undervaluation. This was like having a permanent discount on all Japanese exports for over 20 years. Every Japanese product was artificially cheap in international markets, giving them a massive competitive advantage. The combination of American aid, Korean War procurement, MITI's strategic industrial policy, technology licensing from American companies, and an undervalued currency created the perfect conditions for explosive growth. The results were staggering. During the recovery period from 1945 to 1956, per capita GDP rose at an average annual rate of 7.1%. Between 1957 and 1973, the country saw an annualized growth rate of around 10% in terms of GNP. Between 1953 and 1965, GDP expanded by more than 9% per year, manufacturing and mining by 13%, construction by 11%, and infrastructure by 12%. By 1965, these sectors employed more than 41% of the labor force, whereas only 26% remained in agriculture. The average monthly consumption of urban family households doubled from 1955 to 1970. Japan became the second largest economy in the world by the late 1960s. By 1991, Japan's per capita GDP was 120% that of Britain and 85% that of the United States. In 1964, Japan joined the OECD, which has been widely regarded as one of the primary indicators of developed nation status. Japan had gone from complete devastation to the world's second largest economy in just 25 years. But here's where the irony becomes painful for America. Complete dissolution of the Zaibatsu was never achieved because the US government rescinded orders in an effort to re-industrialize Japan as a bulwark against communism in Asia. The Cold War logic made sense at the time. Better a strong capitalist Japan than a communist one. But America was rebuilding its future economic competitor with American money and American technology. Trade tensions began almost immediately. Textiles were the first major Japanese product after World War II to strain multilateral trade relations, with the Japanese government responding with voluntary restraints in December 1955. A major textile dispute in 1969 to 1971 brought economic tensions to a level that threatened to overwhelm the bilateral relationship for the first time. From the mid 1960s until at least the late 1980s, the trade balance was in Japan's favor. Japan's surplus with the United States grew from $380 million in 1970 to nearly $48 billion in 1988. America had spent billions rebuilding Japan, transferred critical technology, provided a protected market during development, and accepted an undervalued yen for over 20 years. And the result was massive trade deficits and the hollowing out of American manufacturing. Japanese cars, electronics, and machinery flooded American markets. American factories closed, manufacturing jobs disappeared. The Rust Belt was born. Why did Japan succeed where other countries receiving American aid didn't achieve the same results? Several unique factors converged. Japan lost more than a quarter of its industrial capacity and was left with overdepreciated capital stock. This allowed Japan to adopt new technologies without having to wait for assets to be fully depreciated. Destruction became an advantage. High domestic savings rates, rising from 16.5% of GNP in 1952 to 1954 to 31.9% in 1956 to 1958, 1970 to 71, provided capital for investment. Strategic government-business cooperation through MITI coordinated industrial development in ways democratic countries with free markets couldn't replicate. Rapid technology adoption and licensing from American companies gave Japan access to cutting-edge technology at bargain prices. Focus on export-oriented manufacturing with an undervalued currency provided sustained competitive advantages. Investment in education and skilled workforce development created the human capital needed for advanced manufacturing. And perhaps, most importantly, Japanese security was the most important objective of American policy. The Korean War was an economic opportunity for Japan, while it was a military opportunity for the United States, marking the beginning of American-Japanese military and economic interdependence. America needed Japan to succeed as a Cold War ally, so it accepted economic arrangements that disadvantaged American workers and manufacturers for the sake of strategic goals. Manchur Olson attributes much of the post-war performance of Japan to the breakup of entrenched interest groups by World War II, which improved growth rates until groups could reorganize and seek privileges. The devastation destroyed old power structures and allowed new, more efficient arrangements to emerge. Sometimes you need to burn everything down to rebuild better. The bottom line is this: Japan's remarkable post-WWII recovery was built on approximately $2.2 billion in American aid, plus over $2 billion in Korean War procurement orders. The U.S. strategic shift from punishment to reconstruction, driven by Cold War concerns, combined with Japan's own strategic industrial policies through MITI, favorable exchange rates, and aggressive technology licensing. The result? Japan transformed from devastation to the world's second-largest economy by the late 1960s, achieving average annual GDP growth of 9 to 10% from 1950 to 1970. America rebuilt its future economic competitor to serve as a Cold War bulwark against communism, then accepted trade tensions that began in the 1950s with textiles and escalated. Through the 1980s, as Japan's trade surplus with the U.S. grew from $380 million in 1970 to $48 billion in 1988. The lesson? Strategic aid combined with smart industrial policy can achieve remarkable transformations. But be careful who you rebuild. They might become your next competitor. Thank you for watching my Money Mint.